All right, what's going on, everybody? So here we are. We already did a little chunk of this lecture. We went through, this is chapter 14, the Civil War. We kind of went through kind of a reminder of all the things that led up to the Civil War. And if you need another reminder, you can go back and watch the 13 lecture. Um, and then we talked about kind of the steps to secession, about how there's a first round of secession after Abraham Lincoln was elected. There's a second round of secession after attempts at compromise failed, and then after kind of the first attack, the first kind of military action of the Civil War, which is going to be the attack at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. That then led to a second round of secession. By the time it's all said and done, um, here, so the map: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas have created a brand new country called the Confederate States of America, or at least they see it as a brand new country. The United States does not recognize it, and that's fundamentally going to be the action that leads to the Civil War. And so we got to this part where we talked about the strategies of both sides. Very quick reminder, it actually kind of looks a lot like the American Revolution, where the Confederates kind of see themselves as the colonists declaring their independence from what they see as this overbearing, kind of oppressive government that's trying to deny them their rights. And the war in some ways kind of plays out that way, which is that, it's a lot easier to fight a defensive war on your own land, which is what the colonists had to do, and what the colonists had to do in the Revolution, and what the Confederates have to do here in the Civil War. Meanwhile, the Union has that very difficult task, as did Great Britain, which is to beat the other side badly enough so they decide to give up, but don't beat them so badly that you further anger them and drive them into continuing to fight. So it was a difficult task for Great Britain. They were not able to accomplish it. George Washington effectively played that defensive strategy and had a war of attrition and made the thing last long enough that Great Britain eventually gave up. That's the Southern strategy as well. And we'll see if the Union has more success than Great Britain did. Of course, we already know they did, but we'll see how. We know that there was basically three parts to the original strategy of the Union at the beginning of the war, which is to blockade the South. The South does not have a navy; they're a brand new country, so blockade the South to hopefully destroy their economy. Don't let any cotton go out. Don't let any tobacco go out. Don't let any sugar go out. So you blockade, don't let anything go out. You take control of the Mississippi River, which splits the South in half and completes something that was known as the Anaconda Plan, which is basically you take the Mississippi plus the blockade, and now you're strangling out the entire South down there. And then the final strategy, as always, in pretty much every war ever, is to take the capital of the opposing side. So they want to take Richmond. As I said before, for some inexplicable reason, I will search this one day. I will look it up because it's defies logic to me. The South moved their capital from Montgomery, Alabama, which would have been a much more difficult target to get to from the north, going across all this enemy territory, to all the way up here in Richmond, Virginia, which is only 45 miles away, basically from 45 to 50 miles away from enemy lines. Now, ironically, we can make fun of the South for doing that, and we should, because it seems like a stupid idea, but it did actually take the Union the full 4 years to take Richmond, and they don't even ever get it from the north. They actually get it from the South. And we'll get to that in a few moments here. But anyway, so that's where we left off. That's the strategy of the Union at the beginning of the war. As the war goes on, the kind of the factors of the war, the realities of the war are going to change the Union strategy. Eventually, Lincoln is going to find the right general. He keeps firing generals over and over again because he doesn't think they're doing a good job. So eventually he finds Ulysses S. Grant. And Ulysses S. Grant employs something called total war. We'll get to that later on. Lincoln also realizes that emancipating the slaves through the Emancipation Proclamation is also an effective military strategy. We'll get to that later on. But those are two things that come as the war goes. At the beginning of the war, it's those first three bullet points: blockade, cut the Confederacy in half by taking the Mississippi. That's the Anaconda Plan, those two first bullets, and then take Richmond. That leads to what we're going to call the Western Theater of the War, which is a whole bunch of fighting up here in Northern Virginia and in Southern Maryland and Pennsylvania, because the Union is going to try to invade Richmond over and over, or invade the Confederacy and get to Richmond over and over and over again for 4 years. And the Confederacy is going to successfully defend it. So tons of fighting right here. We're going to call it the Eastern Theater of the war. And a lot of fighting along the Mississippi. We're going to call that the Western Theater of the war. Now, these are important terms because for the rest of the lecture, I'm going to keep kind of jumping back and forth and say, okay, now we're talking about the Eastern Theater. Now we're talking about the Western Theater. We're going to kind of see how these two different theaters advance at the same time. Towards the end of the war, the rest of kind of this part of the South, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, is going to get pulled into it. This stuff we're never really going to talk about. It's not really all that important. But for the first 2.5 years of the war, we're really looking at, I guess I should say 1.5 to 2 years of the war. The Western Theater is pretty much all along the Mississippi right here, and then Northern Virginia, and then that Southern Maryland, Southern Pennsylvania area. So Eastern Theater, Western Theater. All right. So that gets us to part 1B, which is military stalemate. So we're going to start in the Eastern Theater. We're going to start in Northern Virginia. So what we have here is the greatest military leader in the United States has joined the Confederacy, and that's Robert E. Lee. And Lincoln actually desperately tried to get Robert E. Lee to join the Union because he was an American general. He went to West Point, the whole deal. But once Virginia seceded, which was Robert Lee's home, he went with the Confederates. And so he is, again, the best military leader in the country at the time, and he's in charge of defending Richmond. So he's going to be out there defending Richmond from the Northern invasions out there in the Eastern Theater. On the Union side, what Lincoln's going to have to deal with is ineffective general after ineffective general after ineffective general. So this strategy of taking Richmond, which seems like it would be really easy because it's so close to the Union, right? It seems like it wouldn't be that difficult for them to get there. It actually proves to be monumentally difficult. And this gets back to one of the issues we talked about before with one of the advantages of the Confederacy, which is one of the disadvantages of the Union, which is how badly can we beat you, right? First of all, there's a lot of arrogance on the side of the Union, right? They thought we have a bigger military, we have more people, we have an existing government, et cetera, et cetera. Just like Great Britain had a lot of arrogance at the beginning, but they also were a little tepid. They were a little non-aggressive. They were a little reserved in how hard they went after Richmond because, again, you're fighting against your fellow countrymen, right? It's a different kind of war. And so because of that, generals at the beginning of the war in the Eastern Theater kept holding back at moments where they could have probably actually hit a death blow to the Confederacy and made it to Richmond, but they kept holding back and not quite getting there. And so we're going to see that happen throughout the first couple of years of the war. Lincoln's going to be firing generals left and right over and over again because he's getting frustrated by over and over again. They're either ineffective, not that bright, or you're not willing to kind of take that aggressive step. It's not going to be until we get to Grant where we're going to see someone that's willing to be that aggressive. So that's why we call the Eastern Theater of the war a military stalemate, because the South is accomplishing its goal, right? Remember, the South's goal is defense, defense, defense. That's all it wants to do is defend. It's not trying to play offense. It's not trying to invade the North. So as long as nothing is happening, as long as no one is moving in any direction, that's a victory for the South because that's what they want to accomplish, right? So the South is doing just fine. General Lee and his soldiers in the Confederacy are defending Richmond, not letting the Union get there. So they are winning in the Eastern Theater, right? So that's kind of the big picture here. For the first 2 years of the war, the Confederacy is winning the Eastern Theater because it's a stalemate. And in the first 2 years of the war, the Union is losing the Eastern Theater because their whole goal is to get to Richmond and they are being stopped at every turn. So here's a map that doesn't really mean anything to anybody, but it just kind of shows you the general area we're talking about. Here's Chesapeake Bay, right? Back to where it all began, 1607. A little bit further down. This is where Jamestown was founded. This is where the Revolutionary War ended, kind of in the Chesapeake region. So this is where all the action's at. But anyway, you can see here's Washington, D.C., right? Here's Maryland, here's Virginia, here's Washington, D.C. right on the border there. And Richmond is just right here. It's not all that far. So you can see the Union troops make various efforts and actually get pretty close at times. Sometimes not that close, but we get close at times. But it just is not happening. It's not getting there. General Lee is successfully defending Richmond. And as a result, the Confederacy is winning the Eastern Theater of the war. The Union generals, various Union generals are going to come and go, right? they're going to be ineffective and unsuccessful at taking Richmond for the first 2 years of the war. And so they are losing the Eastern Theater. The first legit battle of the Civil War, right? So we already talked about the attack on Fort Sumter, which is kind of the unofficial beginning of the Civil War, just like Lexington and Concord were kind of the unofficial beginning of the Revolutionary War. No one had declared war yet, but it was a point at which now that we're shooting things at each other, it's probably time for war. So the Battle of Bull Run is the first unofficial part, first unofficial battle of the Civil War. And there was a widespread belief in the North that this war would be not, that it wouldn't even be a war, right? We're calling it a war right now. I'm calling it a war right now. We call it a war right now. Back then, people weren't saying, well, we're in a civil war in July of 1861. That wasn't the mindset, right? Again, the South seceding is a big deal, but in the moment, it felt like, okay, people have threatened to secede before. They're taking it a step farther. Maybe we can compromise them back, or maybe we just have to kind of like beat them up a little bit in a couple of battles and they'll come back or whatever. No one knew this was going to be a 4-year-long, 620,000 casualty war, right? This is something where a lot of people thought it would be like a nice short little thing, right? We've seen rebellions before, right? Bacon's Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, Shays Rebellion, right? We've seen those types of things before, and they're always just put down, and they're a paragraph or two in a history book. They're not a full chapter. So that was kind of the expectation for a lot of people in the North. We have a stronger economy. We have a technological part of, we have industry, we have factories, we have more men, we have more money. Like this, we have a government that exists, we have a military that exists. Is kind of a joke. Well, they definitely underestimated the Confederates. And the first battle of the Civil War, just called the Battle of Bull Run, happens in July of 1861, is kind of a sign of that. I mean, people were so arrogant that they even came out with like picnic baskets and blankets to sit on a hill over the battlefield just to watch it for entertainment. They thought it would be a short little battle. The Confederates would kind of wet themselves and go home crying and say, okay, never mind, that was a bad idea. And the whole thing would be over. And what actually happens is that the Confederates, who generally are just much better fighters than Union soldiers. The Southerners are better fighters than the Union soldiers are, even though they have better military leadership, et cetera, even though they don't have a functioning government yet. The opposite happens, that as soon as the rebels show up, and they show up like crazy, a lot of the Union soldiers get scared and run away, right? Like legit get scared and run away. There's all these stories about how like the breakfast that the Union soldiers was still warm by the time the Confederates had won the battle. Like it happened that quickly. And this was a huge wake-up call to a lot of people to be like, oh wow, that was really embarrassing. Like we thought we were going to win that football game, like 48-3, and not only was it a closer game than we thought, it actually was kind of a 48-3, but the other side won. Like we got absolutely obliterated. And then there was this kind of thing that sunk in that said, oh, okay, like this is going to be a legit war. So you see at the bottom of the slide, it ends this concept that'll be like a cute little 90-day war. So we're not going to go through every single battle in the Eastern Theater. There's tons of them, right? Battle after battle after battle after battle throughout the summer of 1861, into the winter of 1861. Usually in the wintertime, people take a break, into the spring of 1862, into the summer of 1862. And it's the same story pretty much across the board. Every time the Union tries to invade, the South stops them. It's going to be the Battle of Bull Run over and over and over again. The North, the Union is going to be ineffective and unsuccessful at achieving their goal. Another series of battles, you can see I told you it's going to go all the way into the summer of 1862, is a series of battles called the 7 Days Battle. This is kind of one of the times where the Union soldiers actually get pretty close to Richmond, but still they will be stopped. And this takes us through June of 1862 through the beginning of July of 1862. And again, there's dozens of battles that happen between Bull Run and the 7 Days battles, and there will be more after that. But again, this is just showing that summer of 1861, when everything got started, the Union is not going to be successful. Summer of 1862, things are still going. The Union is still unsuccessful. Lee is successfully defending Richmond. The Union generals, including, you can see McClellan right here, are ineffective. And they're getting, like I said, it's like a, I don't know, I can't think of what those doors are called, but a rotating door. I don't know. Anyway, so just general after general after general, as Lincoln keeps firing him and trying to find the right guy that's willing to just go hard and like be aggressive. And so many are unwilling to do so. So that's kind of where the Eastern Theater of the War is at the beginning, just an absolute stalemate because the Union keeps invading. and the Confederacy keeps stopping them. But there will become a point where things will change. Well, I should say actually things won't change at all, but they will change a little bit. So after the Confederacy has an immense amount of success with their strategy of defend, eventually General Lee is like, you know what if we invade? Like, what if we switch our strategy? What if we actually go on the offensive? So the idea of the Battle of Antietam, the strategy behind that was Lee thought, okay, what if we invade Maryland? Because that's a slave owning state that stayed with the Unions, one of those border states, right? And remember, that's the one that Washington, D.C. shares a border with Virginia and shares a border with Maryland. So Virginia's already gone to the Confederacy. So Lee has this idea, okay, we've been defending successfully all this time. We're like undefeated, right? Pretty much. So let's go on the offensive. Let's invade the North. Maybe we could flip Maryland, bring it down to the Confederacy. Washington, D.C. will be completely surrounded, and we could bring an end to this war altogether. So this was a moment at which the Confederacy was actually really this close to winning the Civil War, right? And that was the first major victory for the Union. The Union successfully defended against the Confederates' advancement. So now the tables are turned. So far, for about a year and a half, this war has been the Union, the Union invading the Confederacy, trying to get to Richmond, and the Confederacy playing defense and successfully stopping them. Then the Confederacy says, well, let's switch our strategy, let's go on the offense. And now the Union is successfully playing defense and stopping them from going into Maryland. So this battle is effectively a tie, but that means it's a victory for the Union because they stopped them. So again, it's a stalemate. Nobody's going anywhere. And this is generally, didn't even do that on purpose. Anyway, this is generally a success for the Confederacy. Antietam is seen as a huge win and a huge victory for the Union, because if they had lost that battle, that would have been a huge blow. DC would have been surrounded. And as a side note, some of the European countries were actually thinking about getting involved on behalf of the Confederacy, just like France did for the colonists, right? And this huge loss actually is one of the major things that kind of made them decide to back out. It's kind of the reversed Battle of Saratoga from the Revolutionary War, right? But it's a huge win. But another thing that's important to note about Antietam is it's one of the first battles, there'll be a few of these, one of the first battles where people really begin to fully comprehend how much of an absolute bloodbath this is going to be. I mean, the casualties, the numbers, the statistics that come out of Antietam are insane, right? So you will see that 4,800 people die in the battle, right? So again, think about just comparison to things that we have some sort of a comparison point to. 9/11, 3,000 people died that day. September 11th, 2001, 3,000 people died that day. And that was like one of the biggest days in American history. I mean, it changed the course of American history in so many ways. Just this one battle of the Civil War, 4,800 people died. 18,500 people were wounded. And an additional 3,000 people will die after the battle. This is in addition to the 4,800 from injuries they got during the battle. So 4,800 people died just during the battle. An additional 3,000 will die after because of injuries. So this is monumental. I mean, people across the United States are really starting to sober up to how insane this thing is going to be, right? That is there are single battles, individual battles in the Civil War where more people die, and this is one of them, where more people die than every war combined, right? Well, maybe this isn't one of them, but there are some. I can't remember if Antietam is one of them. Gettysburg is one of them for sure. Antietam might be one of them, but there will be more people who die in this particular, or in one particular battle during the Civil War, and this might be one of them, sorry, should have checked that before, than all of the American wars combined before that, which is insane, right? And this is one of the ones that if it's not that, it's starting to lead to that. And so people are really starting to have this kind of like awakening to how insane this thing is going to be. So Antietam is a monumentally important battle for two reasons. One, because of that huge kind of like, oh no moment that everybody has, where it's like, this thing is going to be awful. This whole kind of thing is going to be terrible. But two, because it was a It was an attempt by the Confederacy to change their strategy, and it failed. And it was the first time they had failed in a battle, really, in the Civil War. Everything stays the same, right? Everything's still kind of like the North isn't going anywhere, the South isn't going anywhere. Everyone's playing defense. Somebody's a gridlock. It is a stalemate, right? So nothing's changing in the big picture, but that's significant because it was the South changing their strategy, invading the North, and then failing. So they're going to go back to their old strategy of playing defense, and they're going to be successful at playing defense again, right? So absolute stalemate in the Eastern theater. Now, if we skip over to the Western theater of the war, it's a different story. By and large, the Union is winning the Western theater, right? So the Confederates are winning the Eastern theater, stalemate, stalemate, stalemate. Over in the Western theater, which is where we want to take over the Mississippi, right? Here's the Mississippi River right here. Here's the Ohio. Remember we talked about how it's good that Kentucky stayed because the Union troops can just flow all the way down until they get basically to here, and then they're going to start meeting resistance. But the Union is basically having nothing but success in the Western theater. They're just like rolling down the river like Tina Turner, right? If you get that reference, good for you. But winning battle after battle after battle. And one of the generals in the Western theater that's going to emerge as very successful and going to start to make a name for himself is Ulysses S. Grant, who's kind of a small-time general, not very well known, was not really considered to be someone who would be in charge of the entire Union troops, but now he's starting to make a name for himself in the West, and people are starting to pay attention. So, a couple of major battles on the Western theater of the war. Some of the early ones: battle at Fort Donaldson, battle at Fort Henry. By the way, these are both taking place in February of 1862. So these are before Antietam. So as we jump back and forth between the Eastern theater and the Western theater, the timeline's going to kind of also like seesaw back and forth, but we're generally trying to keep it things happening at the same time. So pretty quick and easy win for the Union at Fort Henry, pretty quick and easy win for the Union at Fort Donaldson. And that's kind of the story of the Western theater, right? We have a Navy, the Navy, I mean, you can't use big old Navy ships or whatever, not even that any big old Navy ships really existed back then, but we have a Navy and we have more men. And the approach of Grant, and this is the reason that Grant is going to emerge successful, is the complete opposite of so many of the Union generals in the East. Grant is aggressive. He is very aggressive. He does not care. Well, I shouldn't say he doesn't care, but kind of he does not care how many of his soldiers he loses, right? His philosophy is, we have more men than you, so we will just overwhelm you eventually. Even if we lose more men than you do in the battle, we will win the battle. So we'll just completely dominate you. And with that aggressive approach, not holding anything back, and Grant has this mentality to a degree, but he has his kind of right-hand man, this dude named William Tecumseh Sherman, which we'll talk about more a little bit later on. He's one of my favorite people in all of American history because he's just a crazy person. There's more people kind of in the Western theater from the Union side that aren't kind of the mindset of like, oh, you're our brothers, you're our fellow countrymen, we should be a little bit more gentle or whatever. They were like, no, you guys decided to try to leave. We're mad at you, and so we're going to punish you. Like, we're going to make you feel the pain. Like they didn't hold back. They weren't kind of being gentle. They really wanted to like make them feel the pain that they felt like they deserved for trying to secede, right? And so there's no holding back when it comes to the Western theater of the war. And this is exactly what Lincoln's been wanting in the Eastern theater, but he hasn't been able to find any generals that have been able to do it. So you probably see where this is going, which is eventually Grant's going to come to the Eastern theater. But first, we got to finish the Western theater, okay? The Battle of Shiloh is going to be a monumentally huge battle, kind of like Antietam, just in numbers of people who die, right? It's another victory for Grant, but this is the first battle that really shows what I was just talking about with Grant, that Grant is relentless in his desire to achieve success and is not going to hold back at all. So the Battle of Shiloh is just another battle in the Western theater. It's not on the river. It's a little bit, it's inland, and it's at a railroad crossing, right? In and of itself, it's important in the strategy of the war, but we don't need to know it for our purposes. The reason it's important for us is because it reveals kind of to the whole country and to Lincoln and to everybody else who Grant is. All the stuff I kind of talked about on the last slide, I should have held on for this slide, which is that he is aggressive, he's going to go for it, so on and so forth. People talk about People talk about people talked about this battle and the aftermath of this battle, and they said you could walk across the battlefield from one side of the battlefield to the other without ever stepping on the ground because there was just that many corpses. There's that many dead bodies on the ground that you can walk all the way across the battlefield. And this, I mean, these battlefields are like, bigger than the size of Cal High, like multiple Cal High campuses. And you can walk from one side to the other without stepping on the ground just because it's bodies on bodies on bodies. I mean, like crazy numbers of people are dying in these battles. Antietam, Shiloh, these are really, really big numbers. And again, a lot of the other generals, the Union generals, probably would have at some point retreated, probably would have at some point tried to mitigate the losses and would have lost the battle. And Grant's like, I will lose a monumental amount of troops and I will win the battle. So, I mean, that's up to you to decide whether or not, that's a good thing or a bad thing, because those are lives that are lost. And that's obviously heartbreaking for their families and everything like that. But this is war, you know what I mean? This is how you win it. So it's a tricky one, but that's kind of Grant's approach. And that's what Lincoln's looking for in the East. So in the West, Union victory after Union victory after Union victory, slowly but surely taking over the Mississippi River, right? In the East, absolute stalemate, absolute lockdown. No one's going anywhere. All right. So part 2 gets us toward total war. And this really kind of connects to Grant's philosophy too. Grant's philosophy is, well, let's do it in a point of comparison, right? So, and we'll see this more when Grant becomes like the general commander of all the Union troops rather than just in the Western theater. But one of the other things that a lot of the generals, the Union generals in the East are thinking about is, one, we don't want to inflict that much damage because these are our countrymen, but specifically for people who are innocent, right? Like we don't want to destroy their country because that's our country, right? We don't want to go through and start burning down, plantations and like doing the types of things that you would probably do if you were going up against a legitimate enemy, like try to destroy everything. And that's the idea of total war. But a lot of that there's nothing that's off limits, right? Like innocent civilians, all that other stuff, right? Not that you're going and slaughtering innocent civilians, but that you wouldn't be like, yo, you guys got to get out of town because we're going to burn this town down, or we're going to rip up destroy this factory, or we're going to, that kind of stuff. Grant will fully embrace the idea of total war. And so too does Lincoln. The idea that, no, we need to just bring the South to its knees across the board entirely, not just win a couple of strategic battles against these people who were in the uniform, but just absolutely obliterate the Southern society altogether. And this kind of gets back to what Lincoln was talking about when he said, a house divided cannot stand. He said, we're going to be all one or all the other, right? So his philosophy is he didn't want to go to war, but if your mindset has been from the beginning that the dam that was built poorly, that we talked about before, that analogy, has to be torn down and be rebuilt as one thing rather than as two things, then kind of destroying the South as part of this war is not going to be that hard of a concept for you to grasp, because you kind of want to rebuild the South differently anyway, right? So Grant is going to take on this total war approach. Once he gets in charge, Lincoln's going to take this total war approach. But more and more as the war rages on, people realize this isn't a thing where we can sit on blankets and have a picnic and watch the war unfold. This is going to be something that affects all of our everyday lives pretty much in its entirety, right? So now that we're really, really into the war, it's important that we understand the advantages and disadvantages of both sides. And I've kind of already touched on some of these. It seems as though the North has more advantages than the South in some ways, right? We have a well-developed manufacturing industry. The South does not. All they have is agriculture, right? We have 3/4 of the nation's, I keep saying we, the Union has 3/4 of the nation's wealth. We have the Union has an extensive railroad system, and that's important because if we're trying to move troops and move goods and then also like keep our economy going and be able to produce the things that we need for the war, that railroad is the lifeblood of our economy. They don't have that in the Confederacy, right? They don't have that down there. So it's a lot much harder for them to keep their economy going. The Union has a Navy, and the Union has a much larger population, 22 million people, and immigration is huge during this point. So that number is growing. In fact, if you went down to the docks during the Civil War, when the immigrants were coming out, they had people there that were like recruiters. They were like, hey, welcome to America, come join the army, right? And a lot of immigrants were like, yeah, because like, I don't really have a job, so I don't know what to do. Really, the only disadvantage the North has is weak military leadership, which we've already talked about, but then also that bigger issue of what does victory look like, right? Like, same thing that Britain had to deal with. It's a hard target to hit, to beat someone so bad that they give up, but don't beat them so bad that they keep fighting. But mostly it's weak military leadership. We've already talked about that in the Eastern Theater. That will be fixed once Grant gets over there, but we're not there yet. The Southern advantages, they have that whole defensive war thing going on, right? All we have to do is stop you from achieving your goals. All we have to do is do what Washington did. All we have to do is turn this into a war of attrition and try to prevent you from achieving your goals, let it drag out, and eventually you'll give up. It's easier to win a war when that's your goal, to stop somebody from achieving their goals than to actually have your own goals, right? And as I said before, they have much better military leaders. Their disadvantages are basically the flip of the North's advantages. They don't have a good transportation system. They barely have any manufacturing. They only have 9 million people compared to the Union's 22 million. And of that 9 million, nearly 4 million of those are slaves. And they're not fighting in the war, right? They're keeping the economy going, and that's important. They're keeping the economy going while the war is raging on. You have all the slaves keeping the economy going. But you can see here, it looks like the Union has more advantage, just like it looked like Great Britain did. But the biggest issue, of course, is beating someone so badly that they decide to come back, but not beating them so badly that they decide to keep fighting, which is very difficult to do. Also, we saw that, well, and part of that is also a lack of willingness to be aggressive and to go hard, because you're worried that you're constantly thinking about what does after war look like when we have to come back together. That's not usually a thing that happens after war between two warring countries. After the war's over, you go away. But in a civil war, like the Revolution was to a degree, and like this is, afterwards you have to come back together. So if I'm just ruthless, that's going to make it harder to do. So at the beginning of the war, we saw the military leaders be kind of soft in their approach. All right. Here are the two leaders of the two countries, which is another advantage for the Union. You have Abraham Lincoln, who's in charge of a country that has existed for 70 years, 75 years. This is a country that's been around for a while. We fought some wars, so on and so forth. But also, he's the leader of a country that at this point has a pretty solid respect for centralized authority, and a growing respect for centralized authority, right? Keep in mind that most of the people who were kind of uncomfortable with centralized authority, they left, right? It's the southern states that are the ones that are most kind of like uncomfortable with a centralized government and a strong government. They all left, or most of them left. So most of the people who are left are people who are more comfortable with a centralized government. It's easier to fight a war when everybody's on the same page and just says, yo, president, central government, you got it, you run with it. And so that exists in the Union because they've been getting used to it for 70 years, and the people who are least comfortable with it left. And so the only people who remain are those who are comfortable with it. On the other side, Jefferson Davis is trying to put together this country. That's the president of the Confederacy. He's trying to put together this country of all of these states who, again, are the states who are most uncomfortable with centralized power. So his whole presidency, which lasts for like 4 years, because that's how long the Confederacy lasts, is him just desperately trying to get some sort of a national strategy together, some sort of unified strategy, or trying to gather these states. And it's like, trying to collect drunk cats or whatever. Like, it's a mess. It's very difficult to organize any kind of unified, centralized, organized strategy in the Confederacy, because everybody's like, no, we don't trust centralized authority. We're going to do it our way. We're going to do it our way. We're going to do it our way. That's the whole thing about the southern states. Whereas the Union has the northern states who are all like, yep, we're with you, Lincoln, go ahead and go for it, right? And to a certain degree, I mean, that's a bit of an overcharacterization, because there are a lot of people in the North who don't like how far Lincoln takes it. Lincoln does a whole bunch of stuff that some people say is beyond the Constitution, where he twists and turns some of the details of the Constitution. He thinks he should be able to do that because we're in the middle of a war. And there's a lot of people who criticize him for it. But by and large, he's in position to have a nation, be in charge of a nation that's more comfortable with centralized authority. Jefferson Davis is in charge of a nation which is not at all comfortable with centralized authority. And that makes it much more difficult for Davis to like pursue a military strategy that makes sense with everybody together. Both sides find themselves in a position where they have to implement a draft. And this is, I'm pretty sure, if you find evidence to the contrary, I'll hear you. But I'm pretty sure this is the first war in American history in which there was a draft in which people were called upon to fight in the war who didn't volunteer for the war because we're just losing bodies and losing bodies and losing bodies. And that's also going to lead to a pretty significant pushback in the North and in the South. In the South, in a big way, right? In the South, in a big way. In the North too. I mean, this is a draft building, or this is a building that has a draft office in it in the North. You can see people are rioting and burning it down and stuff like that. So it's not an easy go for Lincoln necessarily, but also in the South, you know, people are going to be very resistant to that. And one of the things that's important to note about the South, I think this is true in the North as well, but in the South, it's really important to note that when you are drafted, you either have to show up to fight or you have to pay a fine. So if you were rich and you were a slave owner and you're part of that group that was on the top of the pyramid, you just pay your fine. You wouldn't go and fight, right? Or you wouldn't even, in some places, we wouldn't even draft you if you owned over a certain number of slaves. So what does that mean? It means the people who are fighting the war for the Confederacy are all those poor white guys who don't own slaves. Remember, 75% of the South are white guys who don't own slaves. And so they're the ones fighting the war. And so eventually you kind of have to start to think about where this might go. You have thousands of people who are fighting to uphold a system of slavery, which we've talked about before in the past, is a system that doesn't even benefit them and in fact hurts them, right? So at some point you would think that they would realize, hey man, we are fighting and dying in the battlefields. I mean, for decades, they've accepted this system. We've talked about it. This happens because of kind of the insidious brilliance of white supremacy that's being perpetrated in the South, right? That poor whites won't stand up against the system of slavery because they feel, you know, that they are, because of their whiteness, they feel that they're superior. But eventually, at some point, if you are the ones going off to fight and die in a war to uphold the system that doesn't even benefit you, and the people who own the slaves aren't going to fight and die, at some point you would think that they would realize it and start to say, man, I don't know about this. And once a draft starts to get implemented, you start to see a little bit of that, of people being like, wait, why are we all the ones going to fight and die when we aren't even the ones who own slaves and we're fighting for this system, right? So a lot of stuff going on, and not necessarily a war that's supported by everybody in the North, and not necessarily a war that's supported by everybody in the South, right? So that's where we are. Now it's a bit of a deviation from the Civil War, but it's an important note, especially for some of you who are focused on, let's see, the final end of the year project, where you looked at how the Northern industrial economy like advanced over time, right? So I told you before that the Republican Party that was created in the 1850s basically was created based on two principles. The first is free soil, and that's the one that really gets us into this war, right? That we now have a Northern party, the Republicans, who are a free soil party, and we have a Southern party, the Democrats, that are a pro-slavery party, right? And the Northern party, the pro-slave, or the free soil Northern Republican Party, the Republican Party, this brand new Republican Party has existed for less than a decade. They're not an abolitionist party, but they're a free soil party. So that's one of the principles they stand for. The other principle they stand for is basically just Hamiltonianism, right? That this is the party that's carrying on the torch of Hamiltonianism, of which Hamilton created and the Federalist Party was based on, and was carried on by people like John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, and then was picked up by the Whigs. Now the Whigs have died and now has been taken over by the Republican Party. So let's take a look really quickly at what their economic policy is. High tariff, so Hamiltonian, right? We'll skip the Homestead Act for a second. Create an integrated banking system. Remember, Andrew Jackson killed the second bank of the United States. The Republicans are going to bring that back. So Hamiltonian, right? Nationally financed transportation system, which is not necessarily like Hamiltonian in that it's transportation, but it's the government spending money in order to like promote an industrial economy. That's Hamiltonian. So they're basically just taking on the old Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams model and spending a lot of money on transportation. Tons of money being spent on railroads, right? Transcontinental Railroad, expansion of railroads in the East, et cetera, et cetera. So that's all basically just the same old blueprint that we've been looking at since the 1790s, with a little bit of changes here and there, a little bit of evolution here and there. But take a look at these numbers at the bottom of the screen. Federal spending in the year 1860 was $63 million. That's how much the total amount of money that the federal government spent in 1860. was $63 million. In 1864, just 4 years later, it goes from 63 million to 865 million. So it increased by $802 million. I mean, that's monumental. Now, there's two things to think about that explains that. Number one, well, we're fighting a war. We're fighting a civil war. That takes a lot of money to be able to do that. So yes, there's going to be a huge increase in spending. But also keep in mind, the people who are more comfortable with government spending and government power are the people in the North, are the northern states. And the people who fought against that were people in the South and the southern states. So through most of American history, there's been this back and forth, this tug of war between the North and the South that has kind of led to this general balance of, you know, the Union one, or the North, the northern states wanting us to spend more, and the South wanting us to spend less. The North wanting us to be a bigger government, the South wanting us to be a smaller government, and that tug of war kind of kept us in the middle. Well, now the South has left, right? They left. So all that's left over is the northern states in the Union. Now they can go hog wild. There's no one to stand in their way, right? All those southern states that were kind of serving as a bit of a blocker, or a bit of a safeguard against outlandish government spending, that's gone. And so now the Republicans can go and do whatever they want. So this is basically, if you took Hamiltonianism and all of the other kind of Federalist, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and had nobody in their way, nobody stopping them. So that's why we're looking at Uncle Sam looking yoked out right now, because Uncle Sam is really, really beefed up. The Civil War is a moment upon which the federal government is going to expand dramatically because of these reasons, right? And so the Republican Party is taking that old concept and really, really running with it in a lot of ways. One last piece is the Homestead Act. So keep in mind that now that the South has left, we've lost a lot of the agricultural portion of our economy, but we still have the West, right? And the West is kind of this growing agricultural part of the economy. So Lincoln and the Republicans want to promote that. So they create something called the Homestead Act, which basically says, yo, we'll give you free land if you move to the West and start growing stuff on it. So they're just giving free land to people if they wanted to go out West and start growing stuff, because they were trying to basically like supplant what was now being lost by the Confederacy leaving, right? And they're gone for 4 years. So we really want to try to build up that Western agricultural part of it. So the Homestead Act did that. But this is, again, kind of taking that old Hamiltonian Republican, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, Whig economic approach and just turning it up to 11, putting it on steroids and letting it flow, because no one's there to stand in your way. From $63 million to $865 million. Ooh, okay. Part 3 is the turning point. All right, so remember, we're stalemated in the East. In the West, the Union is kind of just rip roaring through it, okay? But we're stalemated in the East. So when we get to the year 1863, and remember, it's basically spring, summer, fall, because in the wintertime, people don't fight back then. It's too cold, can't really move around, can't really, transport things. Everybody just kind of takes the winter off. So when we talk about, it's kind of like, think about it like 1861 was round 1, 1862 was round 2, and now we're getting to 1863. 1863 is going to be the year where everything changes. There's going to be a huge turning point. Everything's going to change. So let's talk about what some of those things were. First and foremost, on January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln realizes it is brought to his attention that the emancipation of slaves is actually a really effective military strategy. Okay, so what happens is that as the Civil War is being fought, and as there is some advancement to a certain degree into the Confederate territory, not to Richmond, as we already noticed, but there's some advancement into Confederate territory, some of the slaves feel inspired to flee, inspired to escape, right? We've already seen that slaves escaping their plantations and going to the North is something that's been happening for decades. But now the North is moving closer, because as Union troops advance in the South in certain areas, slaves become aware of the fact that, hey man, there's like a Union camp nearby. If I leave my plantation and make it there, then maybe I'll be free. So all of a sudden, all these slaves start showing up to these Union camps. And at first, a lot of the generals are like, we're not here to liberate you. That's not the point of this war. Like, go back to your plantation. And they rejected the slaves from showing up. Remember, Lincoln was very adamant at the beginning of the war. This is not about emancipation. This is about, his whole thing is, bringing the country back together. Take a look at this quote right here from Abraham Lincoln at the beginning of the war. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. Right? So that's his whole goal, is saving the Union. But then look at what he says next. If I could save it by freeing all of the slaves, I would do it. So he's like, emancipation isn't the goal of this thing. Emancipation is just something where it's like, if I can make the whole thing, if I can bring everybody back together and we can move on as one country without freeing any of the slaves, cool. That's what it takes. But if what it takes to do that is to actually free all the slaves, and I'll do that too. And that's the reality that they're going to realize, is because eventually there's going to be one general that gets it, right? And a whole bunch of slaves are going to show up and be like, yo, like, we escaped. Like, will you give us, like, let us stay here? And he was like, well, hold on. If you're here instead of on your plantation, then who's working on the plantation? Nobody. So he realized, well, wait a minute. If we start to encourage the slaves to leave their plantation, then the entire Southern economy will collapse. And we already have a blockade around the South. And one of the goals of the war is to kill their economy through the blockade. But if they don't have slaves working on the plantation, the whole economy is going to collapse. So he sends a letter to Lincoln and says, yo, like, here's an idea. And Lincoln's like, that's brilliant. So Lincoln signs something called the Emancipation Proclamation, which becomes a law or whatever, on January 1st, 1863. Now, it's important to note what the Emancipation Proclamation said. It does not free all of the slaves. All of the slaves in the United States will not be free until the 13th Amendment is passed, right? So if you're ever on Jeopardy or whatever, and the question is what ended slavery in the United States, it's not the Emancipation Proclamation, it's the 13th Amendment. Because, so a few things to think about. Number one, it says that we will emancipate the slaves in all of the states that are in rebellion. Remember, there are 5 slave states that are not in rebellion. 5 slave states stayed in the Union. And Lincoln said, those slaves are staying where they are, right? Then we're not freeing those slaves. Because if he had tried to free those slaves, what would have those 5 states have done? All right, cool, we're out here, we're leaving too. So he's not freeing those slaves right now, right? Because those states would then leave and then we'd be in big trouble. So he says all of the slaves that are in the states that are in open rebellion are now free. Now, what effect does that actually have? Not much, because all of the states that are in open rebellion are going to be like, what? Lincoln said we have to get rid of our slaves. Oh man, okay, you guys are free. Like, the Confederacy thinks it's a different country. For Abraham Lincoln to say you guys have to free your slaves, they're like, what? That doesn't, no, like, you're not in charge of us. We have our own president. That would be like if, like, the Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, was like, okay, there's no more speed limits in America. And we're like, what? You're not, like, you're not in charge of America. Like, what are you talking about, right? So the purpose of it wasn't hoping that all of the southern states would free their slaves. It was to send a message out that if word got out to slaves somehow, just through the grapevine, that more slaves became aware of the fact that they were actually supposed to be free, that would encourage them to do exactly what some slaves had already been doing. Is once they found that Union troops were nearby, they'd say, we're out of here, we're gonna go over there and let those guys protect us. And it was a message to all the Union generals, like, if slaves show up, don't turn them away and send them back, let them stay with you, because our whole goal is if they all leave, then the economy will collapse because no one's going to be working on those plantations. So the Emancipation Proclamation, the initial attempt at freeing slaves, was not some humanitarian effort. It was not some kind of moral crusade that Lincoln was on. It was a military strategy. If their economy collapses, they won't be able to fight anymore, right? Prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, I probably should have said this before because this goes back to kind of what was pushing it. 1 out of 7 slaves had abandoned their plantations and arrived at Union camps, right? So that was before the Emancipation Proclamation. So this is what pushes them to do it, this realization of, oh, wait, if we encourage this, then that's going to have a huge impact. And it does. By the time the war is over, 400,000 refugees, and there are 4 million slaves. So this is, not a majority of them, but it's still a pretty good chunk. 400,000 refugee slaves will arrive at Union camps during the war. So this is one of the major points that we said part 3 is a turning point of the war. It's one of the major turning points because this is really going to have a huge effect on the economy. A lot of Confederate soldiers are going to start abandoning their posts. They're going to start going back to their plantation saying, sorry, I can't fight. I got to go back to my land. I got to go figure this out. Like, I got to figure out what's going on over there, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Most of them, whatever. But so this is going to really start to disrupt the South. So that's a huge piece of it, right? Another kind of significant point here is that with the 1863, they also started to create their first black battalions, the black regiments in the army. It's the first war where the United States allows African Americans to fight in the war. Now, it should be noted that battalions are still segregated. They're all white battalions and regiments, all black ones, and that the officers in charge of those battalions are white, and that the black soldiers got paid less than the white soldiers. But it's a pretty good step forward, allowing African Americans to fight in the war, especially in a war that will become a war of emancipation. Right now, if you have the time on your hands, and I don't know if it's anywhere streaming, it must be. There's a phenomenal movie called Glory about the 54th Regiment. It is absolutely amazing. Highly recommend you watch it on your free time over Christmas break, whatever. Absolutely amazing movie. Great cast: Morgan Freeman, Denzel Washington, Matthew Broderick, just all across the board. Amazing movie. Highly recommend you check it out. But the biggest points of 1863 that are the biggest turning points are going to be battles, right? So we're going to go back to the Eastern Theater War, where everything is basically still deadlocked, right? After 1862, Antietam was a failure for the Confederacy. They went back to just playing defense. The Union is still completely ineffective at making any progress towards Richmond. So we are still in a stalemate in the East. The Union's not getting anywhere. The one time the Confederacy tried to invade the North, they didn't get anywhere either. So now going back to the Eastern Theater War of 1863. So a couple more battles, or 1862, I guess 1863. So in December of 1862, Battle of Fredericksburg, yet another attempt at getting to Richmond that was blocked by the Confederates. Battle of Chancellorsville in May of 1863, yet another attempt by the Union to get to Richmond, blocked by the Confederates. So we are back at stalemate and back at a place where General Lee, General Lee, I was going to say his first name and then for some reason just forgot it right now. Anyway, and there's no reason to say his first name. General Lee and the Confederates are successfully stopping the Union soldiers from getting down there. So after they rack up some more victories, General Lee, David Lee, why am I not remembering his first name? This is so weird. Anyway, after they rack up some more victories, General Lee's like, wait, I have an idea. And he brings his commanders in. He says, I have an idea. What if, now that we have all this victory, what if we invade the North instead of just playing defense? And then they were all like, we tried this already at Antietam and it was a total failure. And he's like, no, but this time we'll invade Pennsylvania instead of Maryland. And they're like, I don't think that's really going to make a difference. So General Lee is a phenomenal general and successfully defends Richmond, but twice he makes the exact same mistake. He invades Maryland and Antietam, gets stopped. It's a huge loss for the Confederacy and a huge victory for the Union. And now he's going to say, well, now let's do the same thing, but this time we're going to go into Pennsylvania. And again, it's going to have the exact same result. This is going to be the Battle of Gettysburg, and it's going to be one of the major battles of the war. It's going to take place between July 1st and July 3rd of 1863. Now, I want you to pay attention to those dates. July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863. Lee invades the North again. Again, this is going to be one of the biggest casualty battles of the war, just absolute bloodbath, monumental. Total of 7,000 people die in that 3-day battle. And yet again, the Union troops will successfully defend against the Confederate troops. So it's the exact same story. After a number of victories playing defense, the Confederacy gets a little overconfident, decides to go on offense, and now the Union is going to play successful defense. So that's why we call it a stalemate, because it is just blocked. Anybody that tries to go one way gets blocked. The other side tries to go that way, they get blocked. This is a major, major battle, because yet again, this is just like Antietam. This would have given the Confederacy a huge advantage, and really would have kind of been a tipping point for the Confederacy. But the Union successfully blocks it, prevents it from happening, and it's a monumental victory. So Gettysburg is huge, right? Huge in how important it was for the Union to defend themselves, but also huge in the number of casualties. And yet again, one of these monumental, huge casualty battles during the Civil War. Now, if you go back to the West, to the Western Theater, the Union had basically successfully taken over the entire Mississippi River, right? This was like one of the three goals. They basically are almost all the way there. You really have one more kind of location that they have to take, and it's Vicksburg, which is a city. It's like a fortress city, right? It's on the on the river, and it's going to turn out to be like, I haven't played video games in a very long time, but I remember when I played video games when I was younger, it was like every battle you or every level you played, there was like some big bad guy at the end of the level to get to the next level. Like you got through the level, and then at the end there's just like that big ugly drooling bad guy you had to beat, and it was so hard to beat him, and you took so long to figure out how to beat him. That's Vicksburg for the Union. They've taken over the entire Mississippi except for Vicksburg, and it's important that they take Vicksburg. It takes them 6 weeks. It is a 6-week assault on Vicksburg, where Grant has them surrounded on land, has them surrounded on sea, and it's just bombarding them, and it's a fortress, and they're not falling. And they actually never actually fall, other than that eventually they get starved out. The military leaders at Vicksburg are looking around, they're saying, we can defend this forever. We'll never let them take it. But everyone in here is starving to death because the Union had completely surrounded the city and there was no food coming in. And so eventually they had to raise the white flag because people in Vicksburg were legit eating like rats and like grass and stuff because there was no food. And so eventually they raised the white flag. After 6 weeks of surrounding Vicksburg and constantly bombarding it, Vicksburg falls. And that is the final piece of the Western theater of the war that had to fall for the Union to be able to claim victory. So at this point, after Vicksburg, the Union has completed 2 of its 3 initial strategies. The blockade, which was easy to do around the South and the ocean, and now taken over the Mississippi. So they've completed the Anaconda Plan. Now all they have to do is take Richmond. That's the last piece. But take a look at what date Vicksburg finally falls on. It's July 4th, 1863. Now remember, Gettysburg ended on July 3rd, 1863. So in the East, on July 3rd, a major win for the Union. In the West, on July 4th, a major win for the Union. And these 2 things at the same time basically completely turned the course of the war. Because after this, it's basically going to be all winning all the time for the Union by and large, right? So that's 1863. That brings us to part 4, which is when the Union will emerge victorious in the war. All right. So these 2 fellas are the guys who are basically responsible for winning the Western Theater. You got Ulysses S. Grant on the left. You got his BFF, right-hand man, William Tecumseh Sherman, on the right. And once these guys have finished the Western Theater, they've basically locked that down. Lincoln's like, Grant, I need you out here. I need you in the East. I need you to be the general commander of the entire Union troops. So Grant leaves a bunch of people in charge in the West, and he and Sherman go out east. And they go 2 different directions, say, I'll meet you in Richmond, right? So Grant's going to go up to DC, up north, and then come down at Richmond from the north. Sherman is going to basically blaze through the south and then come up at Richmond, through Atlanta, and then come up at Richmond from the south. And they're going to hit Richmond from two different angles. So let me see if I can find them. Do I have a general map around here somewhere? I must. Come on, man. I don't have like a map of the United. Oh, that's a pretty good one. Okay, this is better. So here's the Western theater of the war, right? And Vicksburg is in Mississippi. So they win here and they've locked down the Western theater. So Grant, they're going to leave a bunch of troops here to keep it locked down. Grant's going to take a bunch of troops up here and come at Richmond this way. And this is going to be, just rolling back up the river and getting there. Sherman's going to basically roll through the South. And this is why William Tecumseh Sherman is one of my favorite people in American history, because he's an absolute nut job. He hates the South. He despises them. He thinks the fact that they have tried to secede and leave is unforgivable. And he wants to make them feel pain. And so his march through the South toward Atlanta and then up to Richmond is just a psychotic individual making people feel pain for fleeing. So he engages again in something that, back to the whole total war concept, in which every single town he comes across, he burns it down. He sends a note out, says, hey, everybody who lives there, you leave. He burns the town down. Every bridge they come across, they blow up. Every railroad they come across, which isn't many in the South, but they rip it up. Every plantation they come across, they burn all of the crops. They are just literally tearing down, burning down the South as much as possible, making them feel that pain and saying, you guys really want to stop this war because I can keep this going as long as possible. He's just an absolute psychopath, and I think it's hilarious. So he's just raging through the South towards Atlanta, right? So Grant's going this way, Sherman's going this way, William Tecumseh Sherman's coming this way, and they're going to meet up in Richmond. All right, so back to where we left off. Whew, that was a long way back to get to that map. How many people are still watching right now? Okay, so these two fellas, and like I said, I've said this a number of times already, the box on the bottom basically like showcases the idea that I talked about before. Both of these men were critical of the Union generals up to this point, thinking they had been too cautious. And Lincoln agreed with them. And both of these guys favored a more harsh stance that incurred more casualties. Total war, not worried about losing a greater number of my men than you lose of yours. If I lose twice as many of my men than you do, but I win the battle, that's a victory for me, right? So it's just kind of, let's grip it and rip it, right? So we finally get to see the battle between the two great generals of the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert. Why did I say David earlier? Robert E. Lee. What was I thinking? Finally, I got it. Okay. So Ulysses S. Grant versus Robert E. Lee. We finally get to see these two men go head to head. Lee has been out here in the East defending Richmond splendidly for 3 years. A couple of oopsie daisies when he tried to invade the North, but overall pretty sterling record. Grant basically undefeated in the West for the most part. So now we're seeing these two heavyweights go head to head. And what's going to happen is basically a 9-month bloodbath in the East from 1864 to 1865 is just going to be absolute, because Grant's not going to do what the other generals did. He's going to go for it. And he's going to send as many people as possible. So starting in May of 1864, we'll have the Battle of Wilderness, which will have over 3,700 people die in that battle. Then just after that battle ends, it'll take us to literally the next day, May, because it goes May 5th through 7th. Now we're on May 8th through 21st. The Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. Another 4,200 people will die. Just after that, a few weeks later, will be the Battle of Cold Harbor in Virginia. That's May 31st through June 2nd. 2,600 people are going to die. That's basically a little bit less than Cal High's population. This is more than that. This is more than that. Like I said, it's just this this battle after battle after battle, mass casualty after mass casualty after mass casualty. And slowly but surely, Grant is wearing Lee down and wearing Lee down and wearing down his troops. And then eventually it gets us to Petersburg. And this is going to be just this crazy, insane, like nonstop, like I said, like bloodbath, right? It's going to be this crazy thing. So it's going to be 9 different battles over 9 months between June of 1864 to March of 1865, in which over 11,000 casualties will be incurred between the two. And in the end, Lee defends Richmond. Grant never gets there. So even after Grant just comes after him and comes after him and comes after him, and this battle after battle after battle, just this long-term slog of bloodshed in the lands north of Richmond, Lee, he bends, but he never breaks. He never lets Grant get to Richmond. It will be Sherman that gets to Richmond from the south. But the reason that he's able to do that is because Grant is keeping Lee busy in the north. So it's this kind of like tag teaming situation where if Grant hadn't been coming from the north, Lee may have been able to redirect some troops to the south to defend it against Sherman. But Lee needed everything he had in the north to defend from Grant coming that way, which kind of opened up the back door for Sherman to come in from the south. So this kind of epic, kind of like year-long battle between these two men is these two great generals basically has created this monumental amount of literature from then on about Grant and Lee and these two great generals going after each other. There's books and books and books and movies and all kinds of stuff about these two men and about them going after each other, and really kind of ending in a tie, which effectively is a victory for Lee, other than the fact that Sherman was coming up from the south. So let's go back to Sherman. Now, this is what I was talking about before. Sherman destroys the South. He marches through, burns down everything in sight, and frees slaves as he goes. So you can just imagine the situation in which there's some small town or something where in the middle of the South, and they could just see Sherman and the troops marching toward them, followed by thousands of slaves who are being freed as they go. And people in that town are like, we got to get the hell out of here because Sherman's just going to come and burn it down. And that's exactly what it does. That's exactly what he does. From Chattanooga to Atlanta, burns down Atlanta, all the way down to Savannah, captures Savannah, up here to Columbia, all the way up here and heading towards Richmond. And like I said, burning down everything along the way, absolutely destroying it. And it's just, to me, hilarious and how ridiculously insane it is that he's absolutely I mean, if there's pictures of the South afterwards. I mean, every city is literally just a pile of rubble. I mean, it is absolutely obliterated, and people are scared to death of Sherman in the South. Because again, so much of what we have experienced, especially in the eastern part, is all these Union generals being like, well, we don't want to, we got to keep in mind afterwards, we're going to try to make peace, so we don't want to hurt. And he's like, nope, I'm not into it. I'm going to absolutely wreck house. So eventually he makes it up to Richmond. And the funny story about Richmond is that the people of the city of Richmond, which is the capital of the Confederacy, see that Sherman is coming, see that they're not going to stop him from coming, know that Lee is too busy in the north fighting against Grant. And rather than giving Sherman the satisfaction of burning down Richmond, they flee the city, and on their way out, they burn it down themselves. They burn down their own city to stop, basically to stop Sherman from burning it down. I can only imagine how much Sherman was looking forward after burning down all these other places and destroying the entire South. Just, oh, I can't wait till I get to Richmond. I'm going to burn that place down so good. And then getting there and being like, oh, they burned it down already. Right. But that's actually what happened. They burned it themselves before he arrived. So Richmond has fallen. That's all three pieces of the original strategy, which of course we've added two more: total war and the emancipation of the slaves. But we've got the blockade, we got the Mississippi, and we got Richmond. Soon after Richmond gets burned down, General Grant, General Lee meet at a little town called Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865, which is basically the end of the war. Pretty much exactly 4 years after the attack at Fort Sumter, which happened in April of 1861. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is, although Grant was much willing to go a lot harder than all those other generals, after Lee signed the surrender and the war came to an end, all of the Union troops started celebrating and hooping and hollering, and Grant told them to stop. And he said, these are our countrymen. Like, the war is over. When the war was going on, I was with you. We were bloodthirsty and we absolutely murdered as many as we could. Now that the war is over, we're not going to rub it in. These are our countrymen. We have to try to make this thing work. And so Grant, had that mindset, right? He was able to make that switch, which is pretty remarkable, from being like a bloodthirsty, I'm going to kill as many of you as possible because I want to win this war. Now the war's over. We're not even going to celebrate. We're going to welcome them back, right? Which is pretty remarkable. So this is the end of the Civil War. That's it. Important to note kind of how the Eastern Theater progresses, how the Western Theater progresses, and how the Eastern Theater and the Western Theater are kind of based on the two Union strategies, and how those two things are actually accomplished. Those are the things I really pay attention to as I think about what's coming up in the unit, in the assessment that includes this chapter, chapter 14. So that's the Civil War. What comes next, Reconstruction, is going to actually be a much more complicated fight between the North and the South, because it's about bringing everybody back together after this, which is what General Grant was just alluding to. So that's it for me. Hopefully you enjoyed that. I don't know. It's a Civil War. I don't know if you're supposed to enjoy it. All right. See you later.